Greetings! Today we'll take a look at a few more offering from LK Chen, primarily Daos or single-edged swords. The primary focus of this video is on this Heng Dao from Tang Dynasty of China, which literally translates into horizontal saber or cross saber. And this is largely due to the way it was worn on the back. And we'll take a look at the place it holds in history and the evolution of edge arms in China and in East Asia. After the Roaring Dragon, true style longsword from the Warring State period of China, offered by LK Chen, I was so impressed that I decided to give a few more of these reproduction swords a shot. Namely, these two ring-hilt Dao, ring-hilt sabers, one from Sassanid Dynasty, the other one from the earlier Southern and Northern Dynasty period. Superficially, they share this characteristic of richly decorated ring hilts. We understand that in earlier periods, double-edged straight swords called jian were the primary edge arm in China, and they had been the weapon of choice for monarchs and military commanders, as well as common soldiers. But since Han Dynasty, which ranged from 2nd century BC to 3rd century AD, a new kind of arm came into fashion, primarily as the weapon of choice for common soldiers. That is the Dao. At its conception, Daos didn't take the form we're familiar with today, which is a curved, single-edged sword. At the time, it was a single-edged straight sword with a ring hilt. Not as decorative as this one, obviously, because it primarily served as the regulation sidearm for soldiers in the battlefield. However, it did share the characteristic of minimal guards, as seen on this sword, as well as the slender profile on this medium-length blade. The Daos were mass-produced in the number of thousands to arm entire armies of foot soldiers. There were also longer versions of cavalry Dao. And in later periods, namely during the Jin Dynasty and Southern and Northern Dynasty, which China was divided into two parts, the single-edged swords called Dao were also used by military commanders and as a high-status weapon. For this reason, the ring hilt became more and more elaborate in its pattern. As you can see on this particular hidden hilt Dao, it featured this swaddle being stepped on by a horse, this sculpted ring hilt decoration, and this very unique hidden hilt inside the scabbard. Later in Sui Dynasty, these styles started to take some form of double-edged jian sword. This is a reproduction of a Dao made in Sui Dynasty, now housed at Metropolitan Museum in New York. You can see here the blade profile is very similar to earlier style Daos, straight single-edged sword. However, the transition to tip become more rounded, take on more of a curve, similar to the katana we know today, less resembling those chiseled tip styles on earlier Daos. And you can see here, it started to take on a guard, even though minimal. Some of the Daos in this period became a status symbol alongside double-edged jian. However, today, we'll take a look at an even later period, the Tang Dynasty Dao.
Chinese kebab. Look at that. You never tell the busting capacity of a Chinese style.
Examine whether or not there are some factual basis for the claim that it is a predecessor or a progenitor of Japanese katanas. We gotta understand that in earlier period in Japanese history, many of the survival examples take form of the ring-handled style, because this style of sword has been popularized within China and is spread across the entire Asia. And you find ring-handled Dao Korea and Japan, and they are primarily a high-status weapon. So you can understand the gravitas of this kind of swords. Many of them share the common characteristics as this ring-hilted saber or Huanshuang Dao. And you find this name in Korean, in Japan. We understand that the term Tang Dao today came primarily from Japan, as it wouldn't make sense for people in China call their own weapon Tang Dao. Sabers in Tang Dynasty generally fall into 4 classifications. One is Yi Dao, literally translated into ceremonial Dao, and they are this ring-hilted sword, ring-hilted saber that has a longer blade, and usually for ceremonial purposes, that were carried by courtiers as a status symbol. The other sword, described as the Zhang Dao, literally translates into barrier saber or defense saber. And there's no surviving example for this kind of Dao. So today, people will base their speculations on the textual description of this kind of Dao. Literally, they are very short, fast, and nimble weapons. So there have been some educated guess that they, in fact, resemble a straight tento, literally a compact-sized sidearm for self-defense purposes. The other classification is the Mo Dao, translated into the exchange saber or device saber. Based on the record of some exploits of the known figures of this time, people speculated that it was actually a contemporary name for the earlier Chen Dao, the horse-length saber, a long saber mounted on a pole. It's a crossover between the polearm and the sword. And the Chen Dao is a single-edged version, while the Chen Jian is a double-edged version. It has a ferocious cleaving power that's capable of cutting a horse or rider in half. The last classification is the Heng Dao, or translated into cross saber, or the horizontal saber. And the name is largely from the way it was worn. And you can see that based on the location of these 2 loops. It was worn on the back as a sidearm. In fact, a regulation sidearm for military personnel, palatial guards, and any retainers or even investigators in the police force. They were definitely used in mixed unit tactics in conjunction with pole arms like the pikes, halberds, and their bigger cousin, the Dao, along with missile weapons such as the repeating crossbows and recurve bows. They also shine when fought with in confined quarters due to their compact size and lightweight, enabling the usage along with shields. Again, there's no surviving example of this kind of sword in China. However, there are swords brought back to Japan from mainland China, purchased by tourists or merchants at the time, and they have been preserved and worshipped in Japanese temples to this day. This particular reproduction is based on a surviving example housed as a national treasure at Shosoin Treasure House of Todaiji Great Temple in Nara, Japan. And we can see there are some features parting from the earlier style Daos. The ring hilt disappeared, replaced by this end cap, and it inherits the crossguard style on the double-edged jian, with a Dao tonko, or habaki in Japanese sword terms, mounted above the crossguard. If you look at the silhouette of this blade, you may as well mistake it as a double-edged jian due to the geometry on the tip. But at a close-up, you can see this is clearly a single-edged Dao with a 6 spine and a very prominent distal taper. Very typical for all Chinese swords. There is a subtle profile taper as well. And perhaps the distinctive feature of this kind of Dao is a double-edged tip with a sharpened false edge instead of the pointy tip at the back or spine of the blade. So this comes handy on some of the reversing cut, or perhaps you can do a sword motion to cut with the back edge of the sword. Also, it makes the tip more aligned with the motion you push a thrust. This perhaps brings into question, how would anyone consider this as a progenitor of the Japanese katana? As anyone, we immediately notice that, number one, it doesn't feature the discard or tsuba on the stereotypical Japanese swords. The other one is that it doesn't have this curvature. But really, you have to consider, were Japanese sabers always in this form? If you look at earlier examples of Japanese katana, or called tashi, grand saber at the time, they mostly feature this kind of guard as well, as they would consider the Tang Dynasty Daos as being superior, so they will try their best to emulate it. Also, in the beginning, all Japanese sabers were straight swords. In later periods, Japanese named those styles of saber the straight saber to differentiate from the stereotypical curved katanas. But really, if you look at the character of katana, it's the same one as Dao in Chinese. So what it really means is single-edged sword. So to a Japanese person, 1796 light hammer saber can be described as a katana. A Chinese style of any style can be called a katana. In fact, even an Egyptian khopesh can be called a katana because it's single-edged. Due to the lack of quality in Japanese iron sand, Japanese swordsmiths have to improvise to purify their iron deposit. And this gave rise to the famous tamagane, or the jade steel. Swordsmiths facing warriors coming back from the battlefield with a broken sword also had to innovate to come up with more durable swords. Because spring temper is not featured prominently on Japanese swords, also due to the reason that Japanese swordsmen prefer sharp edges on very hard steel, something will have to give. And Japanese swordsmiths started to make differentially hardened blades so that the spines become softer. The blade can maintain a keen edge for longer while not having to become too brittle and prone to breaking. Under stress, it will bend rather than break. And this differentially hardening process will give this natural curve to the blade. So the curvature of this blade is introduced by the forging process, not by intention. I think that the surviving antique examples, like in Japan, lends credits to the series that Chinese swords has a strong influence to the development of Japanese swords. But we have to be careful that we shouldn't oversimplify things and overemphasize the Chinese swords' influence in the history of swordsmithing in Japan, as we always have strong evidence that Japanese swords at least partially originated in swords of Emishi people. The northern indigenous people, derogatively called the true barbarians by the Imperial Japanese, who emigrated from mainland Asia to Japan during the course of the first millennium. You can definitely see that the earliest Kenugigata tashi, which is the hair tweezer style tan on the earliest tashis, are definitely influenced by the swords used by Emishi people. And the tsuba definitely comes from the discard on many barbarian swords. You definitely see this kind of guard on some of the early period tashis. We can say with confidence that this Tang Dynasty Chinese style is one of the progenitor, not the only one, of modern Japanese swords. However, it does take many of its distinctive features, namely the tuba, discard, and the unique end cap, namely the Fujikashira. Fittings on the blade and the ethos on top of the same or racing is mostly a Japanese thing, as you never truly see it on Chinese style swords. Another parting feature from early style Daos of this cross saber is perhaps the elongated grip. So earlier Daos mostly featured a short grip for exclusive one-handed usage. However, if you compare the lengths of grips on these two swords, you can clearly see that this one is uniquely suitable for two-handed grips. And you can consider this Dao as a true handed half sword. There's enough space for you to place your offhand on the grip to facilitate the utilization of better leverage and better stabilization during your handling. However, the weight of the sword can tell you that it is primarily for single-handed usage. The first impression you have when you pick up this sword is how light it is. Despite its beefy thickness of the blade, and you can easily maneuver this in one hand and have very accurate point control. You can fence with one hand all day without fatiguing yourself. You don't even want to use two hands. You can easily grab a shield or free your offhand to do grapplings. However, it is perfectly intuitive for you to add the second hand to increase the power of a cut or add stability to your thrusts. I quite enjoy this hand and half feature. However, when we go through the fin and finish of the sword, we can see that some of the components of this sword is so self-defeating for you to add this second hand. Now, first, let's go back to the blade, which is so lightweight and well balanced. You can see here, the point of balance is exactly at 4 inches from the guard, which is quite ideal, especially when you consider the lightness of the blade. As we talked about earlier, this blade has a subtle profile taper and a very pronounced distal taper. It's made of high carbon spring steel and has a good flex given the length of the blade. This model of Heng Dao offered by LK Chen has 3 grades to choose from, and different grades feature different blade steels and wooden material on the fittings. The Elite and Commander grades both feature different pattern welded steels. This particular warrior grade example sports a blade made of what's claimed to be Hatfield manganese alloy steel. I suspect it's just 65 Mn, which is a Chinese mangalloy steel that contains 1% manganese, as opposed to the 14% on Hatfield steels, which are non-magnetic due to the very high manganese content. I tested this blade and it is indeed magnetic. So if this is actually 65 Mn steel, its properties should be comparable to 1065 and 5160 steel. Very tough and durable. The false edge is sharpened, so you can easily do a false edge cut. Coming back, the tip is more acute than the styles of Dao with the tip on the spine. And through the entire length of the blade, it has a single bevel from the spine down to the edge with a nice flat point. This means that it is an excellent cutter despite its relatively slender profile. The edge geometry is excellent, the sharpness is incredible, and it is quite a fun sword to cut with, given its very lively handling and the rigidity and the almost symmetric tip style, making it an excellent thruster as well. This blade is mono-tempered and hardened with a spring temper, as I discussed earlier. However, on the blade, there is some differentiation of coloring between the spine and the edge. This is most curious, as this distinction usually appear on differentially hardened steel. So I'm not sure whether this is caused by different polishing or there's some differentially hardened process into it, but it looked quite unique. The blade is perfectly straight both the spine and the edge. And there's minimal rippling on both surfaces. So indeed, a very well done blade. How about the rest of the fit and finish? Well, the fitting is made of iron with a matte finish, which both my wife and I quite enjoy. It is quite different from the earlier style of shiny brass fittings on Chinese styles, and it gives this very utilitarian, no-nonsense feel, very stern and minimalist design, which is quite appealing while not being overly plain. If you look at the crossguard, it has these geometries and patterns which kind of resemble clouds, and it has certain thickness on this plane, which goes very flush with the scabbard. It has this blade collar. It's also made of iron with a black and matte finish to be consistent with the rest of the fitting. But this habaki, while being fitted very nicely with the blade, with very little gap, so there's no worry of any water or blood or moisture getting into the blade and the tin. It's not very well fitted with the mouth of the scabbard. You see that it's very flush with the crossguard, which is very attractive. However, if you just shake the blade, it'll fall out. So it's not a tight fit. I would like to see this improve. Even though you can say this is a munition grade to arm an army, still having a loose scabbard isn't a very desirable trait for soldiers on the battleground. Accidents want to happen. And you can see that in the later period Japanese swords, there is no fushikashira that we are familiar with, but there is a similar end cap on the end of the grip. And there's an integrated part that wraps around the grip on the crossguard here. So the transition between the grip and the crossguard isn't very jarring. The crossguard is very well done. All the edges are very crisp, and they are rounded to avoid causing any discomfort to your hands. Crucially important for you to handle the sword. It's comfortable for you to hold on to with your hands pressed against the crossguard, which I quite enjoy. It's a shame that, on the contrary, the end cap doesn't have this unique consideration. You probably can't see, but I can feel that some of the ledges on the end cap is quite sharp. Also, as this decorative flower pattern for the pin, with the brass going through, which is in itself, it looks nice, but the ledges are incredibly sharp. So for you to put your offhand on the pommel and do a cut, it's very likely to cause a lot of discomfort to your palm and your thumb. This definitely has to be improved. And this shouldn't be very hard. As you can see here, the flower pattern is an add-on to this cap here. So it's a separate piece. You can easily round down these ledges to make it comfortable for your hands to hold down to. And you can say that, oh, maybe you are not supposed to hold down this end cap. And this is a debate for historical European martial arts as well, whether or not you should hold down to the pommel. But many people, and many treatises indeed, like to suggest that you should hold down at least partially to the pommel or this end cap. And indeed, it is very crucial for you to maximize the leverage. This end section on the butt cap has its ledges somewhat run down, so it's fine. Just this decorative flower pattern pin here. If we sheath the sword, and you can see that the grip is the same style of the saber, of plain wood. It's relatively smooth, but it does have a good traction when you handle it, so it's not slippery. And you can see there's one pin that secures the tan within the grip, similar to some earlier period tashis. It feels very secure, very well mounted. Also, it's perhaps difficult to demonstrate, as this grip is in fact a teardrop shape. So even though it doesn't have any tapering or wasted geometry, it's very ergonomic. So it gives you a good feel of where the edge is, and you wouldn't mistake it this way to strike with the spine, as if you only judge from the profile of the blade. It's a little bit difficult for you to make out due to the symmetrical tip. And this is quite different from the grips on Japanese style swords, as they are mostly oval. You can see here the mount and the scabbard also have this teardrop shape, so there's no confusion. Now, if we look at the scabbard, it has the same style of fittings as the hilt components. Its shape here mirrors the end cap here. The appearance of these iron belt loops also conform to the rest of the fitting. The mount of the scabbard is very flush with the ridge on the crossguard. If we compare the handling characteristics of this Heng Dao to Japanese katanas, particularly the stereotypical Shinto style of katanas, the most distinctive feature is obviously the straightness of the blade and the entirety of the sword. The other one is how much lighter and how much livelier it is comparing to the average katana. Of course, there are lighter katanas in history, shorter ones, obviously, for different purposes. However, this sword, given its size, is so lively in hand. One thing prominent about this Heng Dao is, in comparison to its offspring, the katana, it lacks authority in cutting due to its lightweight. It relies purely on the tip speed, which is admittedly easy to generate given the well-balanced blade. So a brief comparison to the swords used by Europeans of the same time period, which is the migration to early Viking-Era swords. As you can see here, they typify this very broad blade with a broad fuller to reduce the weight of the blade. Still, they are mostly blade-heavy chopping swords with limited thrusting capacity. They don't handle very similarly to this contemporary Chinese sword at all. And you wonder why? Well, Viking-era swords are typically paired with a large round shield with center grip. You have a lot of manipulation in the offhand with your shield to turn and deflect your opponent's weapon, axis, swords. So the Viking-era swords are just there to do the job. A coup de grace implements. The purpose is to remove a limb or a head. So not a lot of maneuver in the sword itself. It doesn't do a lot of deflection and parries. Earlier Chinese shields are those big tower shields, much like the Roman scutum. In later periods, since the Han Dynasty, they become smaller, resembling the medieval European hand pavis or heater shields. Sometimes they are round and oblong wooden and rattan shields as well. They are not typically paired with this kind of swords. The Heng Dao is specifically described in the official record of history as a sidearm for, I would say, crossbowmen, archers, perhaps pikemen, halberdiers, or even specialist corps such as the troopers wielding the zhenmajian, horse-laying sabers. Well, it's only natural that this Heng Dao handles very lively, and the context it's used is very different than the typical Viking-era swords. Well, the other thing is that Heng Dao is a regulation sidearm for centralized troops in China, while the Migration era and Viking-era swords are mostly higher status weapon for chieftains, maybe jarls, and their elite housecarls, you really can't expect the average conscript in the army to have the same strength and physical prowess to wield a heavier sword. So you might as well make them more maneuverable, easy to train with, easy to fight with, than the Viking-era swords. Well, the balance of Viking-era swords make it less of a sling without a shield. By itself, it's just not great defense-wise. You notice that most of these units I just mentioned will not be using a shield. The troops that do utilize shield with a sword will most likely use primarily stabbing and thrusting behind the shield in a formation, rather than doing these wild cuts with big motions. The other reason is perhaps the configurations of armor. Most of the armor used by standard troops were laminar armor at the time. So jabbing into the gaps of those smaller steel plates might be an effective way to hurt your opponents. We also know that armor made of bigger plates were occasionally used by Chinese and their neighboring cultures at the time. Perhaps the widespread of heavy armor demands a better thrusting sword with better rigidity and better thrusting tip, while the Europeans in the Viking era and earlier migration era perhaps faced mostly opponents clad in nothing but clothing. Only the elite warrior class and nobility could afford mail armor, and that's a very small number of the troops. Perhaps a closer comparison would be this late medieval arming sword. Again, you can see, even though their profiles are kind of different, it actually feels similar in hand. They're very nimble, lightweight sidearms. They can both cut and thrust really well. So what do I think of this sword after the cutting? Well, it cuts like a razor, pass through the target without much of a resistance. It's surprisingly efficient at light target cutting, given the long bevel from the spine to the edge, and it's a good thruster as well. After I cut up a bottle, there is a stump with a little bit of water left on the stand, and I try to give a light-hearted thrust. Surprisingly, without much of mass left in the bottle, I pierce through both layers of the bottle. It's a kind of a hard shell, so it's pretty surprising. With this tip geometry and the sharpened false edge and the rigidity of the blade, it appears to be a piece that can deliver very rigid thrusting. So, a good cut and thrust sword. In the migration era China, that given the style of its fitting, no doubt takes some inspiration from Persian swords from the Sassanid Empire. And the warrior grade Heng Dao at $280 is definitely a steal for any practitioners of Chinese martial arts or even just swordsmanship in general, and any cutting enthusiast. The spring steel makes it durable, but still the edge geometry and sharpness out of the box make it an extremely efficient cutter. Very fun to handle as well. So there you go, the LK Chen Tang Dynasty Heng Dao, a good reproduction of a historical piece.